Okay, hello everyone. I'm Jamie Flunchball. I'm here with Dr. Tom Craig, assistant professor at DeSales University. We're here to talk about strategy. He teaches undergraduate courses in business and management, MBA courses in strategic management, strategic entrepreneurship, innovation, creativity, and leadership. So, good person for this topic. So,
Thanks, Jamie.
Tom, tell us more about yourself.
Sure. I grew up in the Lehigh Valley, and I went to Temple University for my undergrad. And for about 17 years, I was working in the software industry for a variety of companies, but for the brunt of it, I was working in the healthcare IT industry for a company called the Cerner Corporation out of Kansas City, Missouri. I was a software trainer, worked my way up into various customer support roles, and eventually, and this was a remote position working out of my house in the Lehigh Valley or Bucks County. And eventually, I was getting my MBA at Lehigh University in the mid 2000s. And in 2007, the company made the decision to move all the remote employees back to Kansas City. So we had the option of moving. We decided not to. And at the time, I was teaching at Lehigh, and I very much enjoyed teaching at the higher education level. And a friend of mine said, well, why don't you look into doing it full time and going for your PhD? So I went back to Temple University, got my PhD in strategic management, and I've been teaching at DeSales University for about 5 years. Taught at a few other universities, Fordham, Villanova, Temple, and Lehigh. And DeSales is a great school. I really like it. It's small. All the other schools are great, but I like the feel, the nice tight feel of DeSales University. It's a good, nice fit for me. And I've been teaching in the MBA program and the undergraduate program for 5 years now. So in that university. So it's a good place to be.
Fantastic. Thanks, Tom. And then,
Sure.
yeah, and I should mention a good friend, and always going to talk me into being a teacher as well. I think one day that just might happen, but for now and again, I pop into a classroom. So the first question is pretty broad, and we'll just start with that, which is, how do you define strategy? What does strategy look like to you?
Well, strategy to me, it's a good question, because I often ask this of my students when I start off the class and say, how do you define strategy? And there's some textbook definitions of it, but typically people usually think of, a grand plan, a long-term scheme for how the company is going to operate, how we get things done, a set of plans or goals that want to be achieved. And those are all good answers. They all kind of fall into under the umbrella of how we define strategy from an academic standpoint. But a lot of the literature that we talk about and that we cover in our courses, and some of the classic strategy literature, they define strategy as an integrated and coordinated set of activities that is designed to capitalize on the strengths of the organization and achieve some sort of long-term goal. And there's many gurus and scholars in the strategy field. Two of the big ones, the biggest one is probably Michael Porter. He's been around since the 1980s. He literally wrote the book, or two books actually, on strategy in 1980 and 1985, his two classic works, where he really defined the field. And strategic management, by the way, is a very young field. It only started in about the 1970s and 80s, compared to economics, which goes way back, and accounting and just general management. Strategic management is a relatively young field in the academic disciplines. But for me, and another great scholar is Richard Rumelt from UCLA. He actually defines strategies as problem solving, where firms need to figure out exactly what is the main critical issue facing the survival of the firm, and therefore you have to understand that problem very well and then direct all of your attention to solving that problem. Whereas Porter takes more of a trade-off type approach. Porter's main theme was Strategy is all about the actions selected and the trade-offs that we make, the things we purposely avoid in order to achieve the goals. We have certain activities that are all interlocking, and then we have the activities that we purposely say we are not going to sell to these particular customers, we're not going to go into this particular market, and we actually make trade-offs because we want to focus and concentrate our energies on achieving the goal that we've set out.
That's great. Yeah, and I, as a lean thinker, the idea of strategy of problem solving really resonates with me. I think that's something that really fits with my mode. And while strategic thinkers have been around a long time, and strategy having its roots in military practices, you indicated strategic management is quite young in academia, but I think it's also quite young in organizations, in the sense that I'll visit many companies, and internal functions are looking to build their strategy, and they don't even know who to turn to in the company to get help with that. And so just the fact that there's very little consistency in how people manage it inside companies perhaps reflects its youngness.
And that's a good point, because I think most MBA programs nowadays, typically, and even undergraduate programs for that matter, when we're teaching managers of organizations, usually the final capstone course of all undergraduate programs is some sort of a strategic management course, as well as at the MBA level. So hopefully, since this field has come around, our contribution to management and organizational science and organizational performance is that now every business school in the world, essentially, the culminating event of the student's experience is this capstone course, which teaches how do we tie all these things together, how do we recognize the problems and fit all these functional areas into one, singular direction that is going to solve the long-term problems of the firm, which it's kind of good for us as a field, and I think it is good for organizational performance.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the data shows that. So so as that matures, it kind of brings to how we even start it. So do you consider strategy more of a process, the decisions or the outcomes that come, or is it just a way of thinking and approaching things?
It's a little bit of all of those, Jamie. It's certainly strategy itself, as the scholars would define it, is the set of activities, the integrated and coordinated set of activities that firms perform to achieve some goal. And that being said, firms can have a strategy. Often, as we'll talk about, or as we've talked about before, firms look at just planning as strategy. We've got a 5-year plan. This is our strategy. However, the way we kind of look at it from our side is it's really strategy is the set of activities and trade-offs that you make, as well as it's going to follow some sort of a process. And that's where the field of strategic management really arose, was what is that process that we go through to define or evaluate or come up with the set of activities, the strategy that firms need to develop. And that's the field of strategic management. So strategic management is a process. Strategy itself is more the outcome of that process.
Okay. And then digging more into the thinking side, what really is the difference between strategic planning as a process and the strategic thinker as a person?
I think as everybody in the organization hopefully should be thinking strategically at all levels, even down to the shift managers and so on, even the lower rung employees, if you will. Certainly the strategic planning is going to be the actual planning itself is going to be taking place by the executive level. Usually it's the C-suite or the senior leaders of each individual functional area, as well as the executives. So the strategic planning is going to take place at that level. But strategic thinking is really part of the management thinking as well. When we teach management, we indicate that there's three main areas in which managers excel. They're technically proficient. That is, if you're managing a group of accountants or a group of chemists, it helps if you know accounting and chemistry. because presumably a lot of managers have risen out of the ranks of the worker bees, as it were.
Mm-hmm.
So being technically proficient is one thing. Being human, having human relations abilities is another main skill set. Obviously, you need to relate to people in order to manage them. But then the third most important, possibly the most important skill set is the conceptual aspect of it, where managers are able to see the bigger picture. Even if you're down at the lower levels of the organization, you have to recognize that your actions and the decisions that you make are impacting the rest of the firm, and not only the firm, but the industry. And so every manager within the organization, and what we teach even beyond the strategic side, every manager needs to be thinking conceptually about where does my department fit into the grand scheme? And if I make a decision, how does that flow throughout the organization? And also, how do other decisions made elsewhere come back and impact my organization? So having that conceptual big picture thinking is really the essence of strategy. And it's also what hopefully every manager is developing. The successful managers, the ones that make it to the higher levels, are usually those that have that conceptual thinking built in.
Mm-hmm.
Or developed.
Right. Yeah. So that really argues that strategic thinking as a capability, which is often listed, and you listed others as well, is a key capability for at least managers in an organization at any level. So just sort of teasing that out a little further is understanding the big picture and how you fit into it. Is there a big gap between understanding that big picture and how you fit into it and deciding the big picture? Or is the distinction only a matter of where you sit in the organization?
I think it is kind of it's a relative viewpoint. For example, if you're the shift manager at a local operation, a store, restaurant, or retail outlet or something like that, you have to understand that your big picture is your sphere of influence that you have operational control over. But understanding, I'm a big systems thinker, so everything more or less is a system. Your component that you are in charge of is tied to other components within the organization, and it's tied to the larger environment as well. So being able to understand the big picture of what your organization is doing, even if it's down at the lower level, you view your organization as a subsystem of a larger system. And where does the actual strategy of the firm actually get developed? Obviously, it's going to be at the higher levels of the firm, but certainly all managers, even down at the lower ranks of management, need to understand that they may be asked at one point to step up, and hopefully that they have built into their brains the ability to see that where does their component fit, where does the next level up, how does that structured, and then keep going up. And I think the more managers can do that, the more prepared they will be to step up into those higher ranks when the opportunity arises.
Yeah, no, that's a good perspective on how it grows over a career and across multiple different roles. So returning to the process a bit, part of strategy, of course, is dealing with ambiguity. You never have perfect information, perfect input. But from a process standpoint, how do you deal with how much input should you get? How do you make sure you get the right inputs? How do you deal with the unknowns? So how do you, in the world and its complexity and information that's always changing, how do you make sure the right inputs come into the process?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. The obviously we're dealing with a lot of uncertainty, and especially for strategic managers who are looking at 3, 5, 10-year out plans. There's the further out you go, obviously, the more uncertainty is built into the mix. And obviously with the strategic process that we teach, obviously it's a cycle that's going to happen. You're not going to just set your strategy and forget it for the next 5 years. You have to continuously revisit it on a annual, 2-year, 3-year basis. However, whatever seems right for the firm. at our organization right now, we do 5-year plans, and probably right now we're starting to look at the next 5-year plan. We just came out of the last planning maybe 4 or 5 years ago, so we're kind of thinking 4 or 5 years in advance of what's going to happen at our university. But as far as the as far as the planning goes, and the uncertainty, essentially what's really critical is there's going to be a certain amount of uncertainty that you just can't predict. Obviously, this whole COVID virus thing is disrupting the world right now, and most companies would have planned for possibly some sort of contingency, but nothing to this extent. This is the truly random unknown that we were not expecting. And to alleviate that, or at least address that, firms need to have built in some sort of, hopefully some resiliency is what's going to allow them to get through this, to overcome the shocks that hit their system and are going to ripple throughout the world, like the tsunami back in 2011. 9/11 obviously was a big worldwide shock. It affected everybody. And you know, even Brexit, when that vote took place, there was ripples that went throughout the world about what's going to happen to the world economy. But this COVID virus is certainly probably one of the biggest of those bunch, and of that bunch. And having resiliency, having good feedback loops, having a system in place where information can flow within the organization as needed. It gets up to the executives as needed for planning purposes, and then the direction is flowed down to the levels where it's needed to do what's necessary. But essentially the information flowing throughout the organization, I think, is really the key. That we're receptive to what's happening in the outside world, and we're also allowing information to flow from the receptors, if you will, of the organization up through the executive leadership.
Yeah. So designing those information flows really does have a big impact ultimately on shaping the strategy, in terms of getting the right information to the right people. So as we think about making decisions, right, whether it's a short-term or a long-term decision, most companies aren't setting strategy with a clean sheet of paper, right? They're operating today, they're executing their plan, they have assets, they have people, they have markets, they have flows and work design. How much should the current state of the organization be an influence or an anchor on setting new strategy? Obviously, if you ignore it completely, then you're building a whole new business. If you get completely anchored by it, well, you're not going anywhere. So how much should that influence how you think about strategy?
Sure. Yeah, obviously, you know, unless you're a brand new company starting out, you're going to have some strategy currently in place. And usually what happens, and often to the detriment of many firms, is they rely too heavily on their former strategy and are resistant to change. They tend to develop an organizational inertia, as we call it, where the firms will tend to just continue on in the same pathway as they've been going for the past few years. And the resistance to change that takes place is due to many things. This is actually the big one. We're making money, everything seems fine, we're just going to continue on down this path. Why change? Why upset the apple cart? Fear, maybe they've tried something in the past that didn't work and they're just a little gun shy about trying something different. The cost of actually revamping and rethinking, and just the expense and time involved with actually setting up a new strategy is it's costly. And that's why firms need to establish some sort of plan. But typically what happens is firms will have a pre-planned strategy going in, and then as conditions dictate, part of the deliberate strategy is going to be jettisoned or cast off as the situation unfolds in the world. So for example, if our strategy was to open a plant in China this fall, obviously with the situation that's arising, a lot of those plans are going to go out the window, and so therefore somebody else, we need to kind of have a backup plan. We need to be resilient in order that we can have our contingency plan set up and be able to switch, and that ultimately becomes the realized strategy that takes place for the firm. So basically being flexible and being flexible as well as having a good monitoring system to see how things are happening in the world is really the key.
Yep. That's interesting. You mentioned one that I always find fascinating, and that was fear. Things that had happened in the past that didn't work has, in many cases, very little influence on whether they work in the future.
That's a great point. That's a great point.
Yet can have a huge impact on what companies willing to do and not willing to do.
Yeah.
So, kind of shifting from setting the strategy more to how you put it into place, as you talked about a set of coordinated actions that deliver on the goal. The senior leaders set the strategy. Many people have to, as you indicated, see how they connect to that strategy. What's the best way to communicate that? How do you get the strategy from those who decide to those who have to see how they fit in?
Well, generally, and that's a great question. We actually have, actually, when you shift from the formulation side of strategy, where you're essentially still in the planning phase, you formulate the strategy and say, this is where we want to go. This is how we're going to achieve it. Now, then we have to get into the implementation phase where we really have to, put the rubber down on the road. And that's usually achieved through the structure of the organization to make sure that, does the organization fit the intended strategy? And one of the great sayings of strategy is that that strategy drives structure, not the other way around. So certainly, when your firm decides, hey, this is the best way that we want to proceed for the next 4, 5, 10 years, you don't want the structure to be what's constraining that. So therefore, when the strategy is developed, the implementation of strategy usually involves at least a look at, if not a change to, the structure of the organization. And that's usually where you'll hear a bunch of restructuring going on if we need to move certain departments or move certain relationships, move people around. The organizing side of the equation is where we're going to start, actually spending money. We've got our plan in place, but now when we actually implement the strategy, we need to start spending money, hiring people, buying machinery, moving, shifting the responsibilities, shifting the structure of the organization around. And another part of that is also the culture of the organization as well. That's a big part of it, where if our strategy is to go in a certain direction, we need to make sure that everybody in the organization is on board with that from the top down, because having that sense of what the organization's purpose is, what our mission is, what we're doing for the next 5 years, that is going to inspire and motivate people to think beyond their own self-interests. And instead of just coming in to collect a paycheck, we actually are coming in to actually perform some valuable, planned out service that the organization is going to achieve over the next 5 years. So if we have this goal in mind, this strategy, this vision of what the organization wants to achieve, that needs to be transmitted down throughout the organization, so that even the lower level workers, managers at the lower level workers as well, everybody in the organization is aligned to that single purpose of why the organization exists.
Yeah. Yeah, and I've said for a long time, there's no one right generic organizational structure, but there is a right one for your org and this period of time, right?
Exactly.
And that really is the point around the strategy should shape it, and when it needs to change, it should have more to do with what you're trying to accomplish than just where everybody feels comfortable.
We actually have there's a lot of cases where the strategy of the firm or the structure of the firm defines the strategy, which goes against all the wise thinking of the industry. Is we want to make sure that we're not constrained by our many firms, however, they're constrained by their current structure. We can't do that because we're not set up that way. Even though we recognize that, hey, this is where we should be going, we can't do it because that's not the way we've done in the past. It's not the way we're set up. The guru who said it, and it's escaping me right now, said strategy drives structure. Chandler, actually, was Alfred Chandler.
Mm-hmm.
But he basically said, let your strategy be determined first, and then based on the right time and the time and place you're in, make your restructure your organization to fit that. which is difficult, obviously. And as we said, there's a lot of resistance to change. And so that's the beauty of management, or the art and skill of management, is being able to kind of work your way through those things.
Yeah. So we're running out of time, but I do want to ask one last question,
Sure.
because I think it evades lots of people, around measuring the effectiveness of strategy, right? It's an elusive thing anyway. It shows up and manifests in the whole set of actions that you take. So how do you measure the effectiveness of strategy?
Okay. Typically, obviously from the process model that we teach, the effectiveness of the strategy comes out in, hopefully what's being achieved is some sort of competitive advantage. We want the firm to be outperforming its rivals, or at least outperforming the industry average. And typically, most firms will have some sort of a dashboard or key performance indicators that reflect we need to achieve certain performance levels on these particular goals, on these KPIs, and presumably, if those are well thought out and defined, by achieving, we've got great customer service, or we hit our targets on, number of defects, or whatever the metrics happen to be that are key for that industry. If those particular measures are achieved at a level that's superior to the industry average or to the key rivals, then ultimately what should result is this competitive advantage that we have. And just from a strategic standpoint, competitive advantage can be very fleeting, in that we could always lower our prices, we could do certain things that allow us to get temporary competitive advantage. But what we're really looking to achieve is sustainable competitive advantage, where for the long term, we just become the leader in the field. For example, Apple or Toyota or somebody like that, who obviously they've got, for many years, they were able to figure out what's the right way to do business, and we are achieving above average returns in our industry consistently. Walmart consistently was beating Kmart throughout the 1990s and 1980s and 1990s. So how can we achieve that sustainable competitive advantage over our rivals in our industry, which then obviously it's going to lead to all the benefits of being a great performer, but then it also sets the stage for when the firm does need to, transition out of its current model and into its next model, whatever that may be, they're poised to do that. They've got the good resources, they've got hopefully the structure in place, the managers in place that are ready to make the next turn, as it were, to move out of whatever the old industry was and move now into the new industry. The new industry of the future. So that's kind of it. I think competitive advantage, sustainable competitive advantage, is what we're truly looking for.
Great. That's a good note to end on. We covered a lot of ground. I really appreciate you sharing your thoughts and perspectives, especially as a researcher and a teacher. So thanks for participating today.
Thanks a lot, Jamie. I appreciate it. And I'll talk to you soon, okay?
Fantastic.
Thank you. See you.